So good afternoon and welcome to our regular Thursday lunch seminars. I'm Dave Maxwell, I'm the Associate Director, and I'm going to talk about my experiences in the Philippines. And of course, in keeping with security studies, I'm going to talk about a couple things: theory, doctrine, and practical application. So theory and practice. I'm also going to give you my travel log, and of course give you, I'm going to tell a few stories, and a few war stories. Anybody know the difference between a war story and a fairy tale? Okay. Well, a fairy tale begins once upon a time, and a war story begins, this is no shit. So I'll tell a few war stories today. I also, since I'm a retired military officer, most people who work for the government or in the military have to give the standard caveats. These are my own opinions and not the U.S. government. But now that I'm retired, my caveat is this: I'm unconstrained by doctrine, I'm unconstrained by funding, and I'm unconstrained by a chain of command. So you're going to hear my unvarnished opinions, whether you like them or not. So I'm going to talk about our experiences in the Philippines, probably one of the lesser-known parts of Operation Enduring Freedom in the global war on terrorism. I'm going to talk about special operations and, in particular, a special warfare approach to both counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. Just to set the stage with a little bit of text here, special operations can really be described in terms of two activities: surgical strike, which is our ability to capture, kill, conduct direct action, counterterrorism. It is epitomized by our ability to kill Osama bin Laden in 2011. And of course, for those who follow special operations, that mission is really the bookend of the failure in Iran in 1980, at Desert One, Operation Eagle Claw, where we failed to rescue American hostages at the embassy in Iran. And that failure led to the rise of special operations, the establishment of the United States Special Operations Command, the Nunn-Cohen Amendment to Goldwater-Nichols in 1987, and that established special operations. And all the investment our nation has made in special operations and in joint special operations was shown to, was paid off the killing of Osama bin Laden. And so that really epitomizes our surgical strike capability. But lesser known are special warfare activities. And these are activities that are both lethal and non-lethal. A lot of people like to talk about direct approach, indirect approach, the hard approach, soft approach, the black approach, the white approach. But really, special warfare activities are really lethal and non-lethal and really depend on working through and with friends, partners, and allies, indigenous forces, having the cultural understanding and the ability to train, advise, and assist to help others defend themselves either against an oppressive regime or against lawlessness, subversion, insurgency, and terrorism. And so those are the two ideas of special operations. And for those that are unfamiliar with those, just keep those in mind. There are many other definitions and activities. The law, Title 10, Section 167, lists 10 special operations activities. But just think of surgical strike and special warfare. All right, the Philippines, a wonderful place, 7,000 islands. So it's really a maritime, an island nation. Democratic, very culturally diverse, particularly in the south. Predominantly Christian nation, and in the south is a large population of Muslim tribes in the south. How many people have been to the Philippines? At least one, two, okay, 3, 4. All right. And just a wonderful place. But the islands, the distance, and of course the diversity pose some challenges. Just to orient you here, to the southwest is Malaysia and Brunei, and directly south Sulawesi and Indonesia. All right, so keep in mind that this forms a triangle, which I'll talk to. Specifically, this boxed area here, really the area of Mindanao and the Sulu Archipelago, that was established as a joint operational area. So our operations to support the Philippine military and government took place in the joint operational area here in Mindanao and Sulu Archipelago. All right, just a little bit about the environment. So I've got to talk about the threat. Malaysia, Indonesia, PACOM likes to call this the T3, the Terrorist Transit Triangle. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why it's important. A little bit about the land, the diversity I've talked about, and of course in remote areas there is often a lack of good governance, the ability for the government to reach into areas, so lawlessness, poverty in remote areas. Threat groups are very diverse. All right, we have the terrorist organizations you're probably most familiar with, the Abu Sayyaf group and Jemaah Islamiyah from Indonesia, and the Abu Sayyaf and JI directly linked to Al-Qaeda, and that's important for post 9/11. But there are other complex organizations and threats. We have the Moral Islamic Liberation Front, the MILF. Philippines loves to have great acronyms. What I don't have up here, after the peace treaty has been brokered here with the MILF, the BIF has grown out of the MILF. The BIF is the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters. You know, so you've got the MILF and the BIF and the MNLF, the Moral National Liberation Front. Of course, they signed a peace treaty in 1996 with the government, and that established the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. Generally, how insurgencies end: political accommodation. The government and the MNLF signed that peace agreement. Of course, Nur Masari, he did break away from the MNLF. He was the leader. The MILF said they would continue to fight, and they've continued to fight until this last year. And both of these, of course, they want separatist autonomous regions, which the MNLF was granted, but the MILF was not satisfied with. And what they brokered is access to their ancestral domain, their lands. Okay, and that's really what they wanted. And you know, they're really close to solving some of the problems. But again, there are elements that continue to break away. The last, and there's many other ones, the Rajan Solomon movement, the Pentagon Gang, all kinds of organizations that exist and ebb and flow in the Philippines, making it very difficult. There's also other threats, complex political threats, criminal threats, local militias supporting politicians. So it's very, very complex. But lastly, is the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army. There's a communist threat in the Philippines. And this is important because even though the Cold War is over, communists still exist. But what's most important about the communists is that is the existential threat to the Philippine government, because they're trying to overthrow the entire Philippine government. The problem for us is that, and for us as practitioners who were given this mission to support the Philippine military and government, is they're not related to Al-Qaeda. And those of you who don't remember, I mean, I know you all remember 9/11, but the planning and execution of that, when 9/11 happened, our entire focus was on terrorism. And even though the New People's Army commits terrorism all the time, but related to Al-Qaeda. And everything was linked to Al-Qaeda. And so what that did is that caused us to want to go after ASG, who were, of course, holding hostages at the time. Prior to 9/11, they kidnapped Gracia Martin Burnham, Guillermo Sabero, cut his head off, and Deborah Yap, a Philippine nurse. They had taken them from Palawan, brought them to Basilan, and but they were related to Al-Qaeda. And so we wanted to help the Philippine government against terrorists that were related to Al-Qaeda. But we were restricted from providing advice and assistance against their existential threat, the communists. Okay, so that puts us in a very difficult position when working with our allies. And of course, the Philippines is our longest standing treaty ally in Asia, one of the 5 treaty nations in Asia Pacific, because Australia is one of the 5. So you've got very complex environment, threats, and of course the result is, especially in the under or ungoverned spaces, is that terrorists and insurgents find sanctuary. They've got mobility, especially on the seas, and access to resources, money and weapons, explosives, and all kinds of things. So it's a complex environment, multiple insurgencies, multiple terrorist threats, and something that we should all consider. The Philippine government has a very, very tough problem. And just think about it from our perspective. If we had this many diverse threats and terrorist activities going on in the United States, we'd be hard pressed to deal with that ourselves. So you got to have a lot of respect for the situation. Just to give you just a kind of a quick rundown on some of the different things that went on. This is, of course, a very political mission, like everything is. Prior to 9/11, Ambassador Mike Sheehan was the ambassador for counterterrorism at the State Department. He recognized the problem. There had been terrorist kidnapping in Sipadan in Malaysia, brought back to Basilan, and the Philippine military did not have a national counterterrorism force. I was commanding the battalion in Okinawa. We were given the mission, $2.1 million to stand up a national counterterrorism force. Organize, train, equip, and establish this force. And we did that in 2000, 2001. While we were training them, of course, the Burnhams were kidnapped, and all before 9/11. Of course, once we finished training, they were deployed, and the typical problem with special operations, this highly trained organization that we equipped and we trained was misused. They were used as conventional infantry, conduct movement to contact, rather than develop intelligence and be able to conduct missions to capture or kill terrorists. They were, there was no chain of command, no special operations chain of command, and they were misused. And of course, we're talking to them, and of course, we said they really need advisors, and our NCOs, immediately, even before we began training, recognized without a command structure, without intelligence supporting apparatus, that they would not be effective. But at that time, Pacific Command and the U.S. government said, no U.S. forces in the conflict area. And so, actually, on the day of, in the Pacific, it was the 12th of September, because we're a day ahead in the Pacific. When 9/11 happened, I was supposed to fly to Zamboanga and to meet the commander and get his assessment. And of course, we couldn't fly because 9/11 happened. But 3 days later, I did arrive there, and we conducted an assessment. Of course, 9/11 caused everything to change. And the Pacific Command said, we should help them. And it went all the way up to the White House and for eventual approval for us to conduct supporting operations there. Now, one thing I want to tell you is that when what's most important, after 9/11, the 5th Special Forces Group, the CIA, went into Afghanistan in extremis, and they conducted unconventional warfare. They toppled the Taliban, the Afghan government, by December of 2001. That was a rapid operation, and of course, Special Forces, CIA, and Air Power advising the Northern Alliance, and they were very successful. And we deployed them very quickly in response. We did things completely differently in the Philippines. Rather than deploying forces, we did what we do best. We conducted an assessment. And in October of 2001, we took General Fridovich, who was my commander, myself, my S3, my intel officer, and then planners, intel ops and logistics and communications planners, and one Special Forces A team. And we spent the month of October conducting an assessment from the strategic to the tactical. Their national security strategy, all their plans, and then we assessed the units down to their combatant command, the Mindanao Command, later the Western Mindanao Command, and down to the tactical units, battalions and the like. And together with the Philippines, we developed a campaign plan, came back to Hawaii, briefed it to Admiral Blair, and then it was eventually approved. The point I want to make is that rather than deploying forces in extremis, we were able to conduct an assessment, develop a campaign plan, and then deliberately deploy forces very methodically to achieve the effects. And what we've done is continued up until May 1st of this year, is really to execute that campaign plan. Interestingly though, when we developed this campaign plan, it was for a holistic operation throughout all of Mindanao down through the Sulu Archipelago. But the approval came back that we could only focus on one small island, the island of Basilan in 2002, right here, because that's where the Burnhams were. So our focus was U.S. hostages, support the forces there. But our assessment, revealed, and as we all understood, the problem was bigger than one small island. You had to take a holistic approach. It wasn't until 2005, and there were subsequent operations, peace or ceasefire agreements, leading to the ejection of the ASG from the MILF territory that forced them down to the island of Holo and Tawi-Tawi, that we expanded operations. Our point, and my point to you is, as policymakers and strategists, is that, from the beginning, if we had executed our entire campaign plan, we might have got further along rather than just focused on what was in the news or what was, seemed to be the priority, U.S. hostages. We took a holistic approach and did critical analysis to try to develop the campaign plan, but politically, we were restrained. But over time, some of those restrictions were lifted, and some people can say, "I told you so." But that's a lesson that I'd ask everybody to keep in mind. This is a deployment of forces. The white, yellow, and green are all Philippine organizations, Philippine forces. The purple are our joint forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Special Forces, SEALs, Civil Affairs, Psychological Operations, Conventional Forces. And we show them this way and make a very specific point about the way that we're illustrating these forces. All the Philippine forces are at top, and the U.S. forces are underneath. And that's really to represent the fact that we are not in charge. The Philippines as a sovereign nation, a government, their military is in charge, and we're advising and assisting. I always ask this test question of people, who owns the battle space? In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Africa, in the Philippines. Well, in the Philippines, the Philippine government, the Philippine military owns the battle space. We don't. We're there supporting and advising. And our forces were well suited to be able to operate without being in charge. Difficult for Americans. We are, the superpower of the world. We want to be in charge. We want to tell you how to do things. My way or the highway. But that really doesn't work in an environment where you've got to be able to advise and assist. All right, my travel log. This is what the terrain looks like. One of the mosques on Holo, Sulu, province of Sulu. It's a beautiful, beautiful country, as you'll see. The U.S. naval ship Mercy came and did humanitarian assistance, what I like to call drive-by humanitarian assistance. All the medical people come down, do cataract surgery, and then SF medics have to do the follow-up treatment for the next 3 months. But they come down and look good for themselves. But a beautiful country. I mean, these beaches are wonderful. Everybody who scuba dives, you love these waters down there. Of course, the tribes, the Tausogs, Yakin, Maranao, beautiful, beautiful place. Very few Americans there. And of course, there is violence. Violence here. The whole co-op was blown up. 5 Muslims were killed, 26 wounded, and I'll talk about the impact of that. This is one of the camps that the ASG had, and I'll talk about the conventional amphibious operation, night amphibious operation to take that. There were 60 bunkers here. Within this, 17 Philippine Marines were killed retaking this. Gaddafi John Jelani was killed, one of the lead, at the time, the leader of the ASG. And it's also jungle. This lower right photo is a nighttime photo, a daytime photo. Looks like night. Okay, triple canopy jungle. And what that means for all of you intelligence practitioners out there is the fact that, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we optimized our intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities to be able to look at the deserts, in the mountains, but we didn't develop foliage penetrating radars. We have developed them. We've used some in Colombia, but we have not been optimizing our intelligence capabilities to operate in environments like that. And so that's just an illustration of how complex the terrain is and what that does. Had training, of course, the Philippines, they use close air support, OV-10s and helicopters, MD-500s. They drop 250 and 500 pound bombs. So the ASGs had military training. They built bunkers with overhead cover to protect themselves from conventional military capabilities. And of course, when you walk the ground there, for those of you who are in the military, you will see their bunker complexes are laid out with interlocking fields of fire with primary, alternate, and tertiary positions. So they've had military training. Some have gone to Afghanistan and fought there and come back and taken their training and put it to use here. Of course, we have a long history in the Philippines. One thing to remember is that the Philippines is the only U.S. colony of the United States. After the Spanish-American War, it became a U.S. colony, and of course, naval strategists realized the importance of the Philippines. Just as a quick aside, the end of the Russo-Japanese War ceded the Philippine sphere of influence to the United States, while Korea was ceded to Japan. And the Taft-Katsura Agreement is what led to the colonization of Korea by Japan, because we wanted the Philippines, coaling stations, and later, of course, Subic Bay, Clark Air Force Base, and the like. But of course, we broke our promise immediately. And Aguinaldo, the leader of the Philippines, we were supposed to grant them independence, but we knew better. They weren't ready for independence. And so there was a long insurgency, a bloody, brutal insurgency after the turn of the century, now about 115 to 105 years ago. And of course the Moros resisted. And for those of you that know the history, the US .45 caliber pistol was developed because the .38 would not knock down the enemy Moros. And so that's why we have the .45 caliber pistol developed today. A few more looks at today and before. Conflict has gone on for a long time in the Philippines. And I haven't even talked about the Japanese occupation during World War II. And I won't talk about the Huk Rebellion except to touch on it. But I'm going to talk about Special Forces and what we do. And, and we work with indigenous forces. If you look at Vietnam, Special Forces here, dressing in tribal garb, eating and drinking and smoking, whatever the Indige are doing there. So that's our legacy from Vietnam, and this is my legacy with the Yakin from Basilan there. So I had to wear that funny hat, and I was adopted as the son of Basilan there. So, and we had our cultural training here with and entertainment there. So there's a long history in Special Forces of working with indigenous forces. All right, so I've kind of given you an overview, talk about the threat. This illustrates the threat, but this is also one of our psychological operations products, translated in English or shown in English. All of the products that you'll see, everything I show you, are translated into multiple dialects for the so they can be communicated to the local people. And I'm just obviously showing you the English here. All right, it's a dangerous place. IEDs, when do you think IEDs were invented? Oh, Afghanistan and Iraq. Actually, IEDs have been trained and it's been part of Special Forces training, and before that, OSS training in World War II. And every Special Forces engineer learns how to make improvised explosive devices. That's where the name came from. But it wasn't popularized until Iraq and Afghanistan, and we had to, all the roadside bombs. But it's really taking whatever's available and making explosive devices to be able to kill or maim people. And they were very good at that, and they still are very good at that in the Philippines. These are just some of the items that were recovered. This is a baby food canister. Inside here, our EOD people x-ray that stuff. All of the different explosive, a lunchbox there. Baby food lunchbox, who are the targets for these? Terrorism is a bad thing. We also have, of course, ammonium nitrate, blasting caps, lots of things recovered. Ammonium nitrate, you all remember 1995, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. That's what McVeigh used to blow up, kill 161 people. So ammonium nitrate, blasting caps, although in the Philippines, we think that those are explosives. We think it belongs to terrorism. It's something that really complicates things for the intelligence analysts, because there are legitimate uses or quasi-legitimate uses. Fishermen will use ammonium nitrate to make fish bombs, to go fishing. Even though it's illegal, it's a way that they will fish. So when these items are recovered, it's not necessarily related to terrorism. Again, it complicates things for intel analysts. Of course, things from overseas, medicines from the Middle East, Arabic writing there. Boats are very important, and the like. So it's a bad threat environment, and lots of people are killed and maimed. And of course, caught in the crossfire between the government and the terrorists and insurgents as well. I love T.E. Lawrence for his quotes, and for all you infantrymen, I was an infantryman. This is not to denigrate the bayonet charge, because that's still an important tactic there, as you all saw when you went to Little Round Top. I hope you all remember your Gettysburg. But irregular warfare is far more intellectual than a bayonet charge. That's what T.E. Lawrence said. It's a thinking person, but all war is. And And so I'm not denigrating the infantryman who makes that charge up the hill, but we do need to think about it. So I'm going to give you my doctrine and my theory, and really neck down all the brilliant stuff you hear from Professor Hoffman and Professor Byman and Professor Krauss and all the other ones that teach terrorism and insurgency. All right, 3 players in insurgency. All right, you've got the insurgent, the bad guys, and the terrorists. All right, you've got the population. We like to call that the battlefield of human terrain, battle of ideas. And then you've got the counterinsurgent. Those that are fighting. Okay, and that's the existing government security forces, military, police, and the like. And then you've got a subcomponent of that, external support for the government. And I like to illustrate this because the insurgents are indigenous, the population's indigenous, the counterinsurgent is indigenous, and then external support. That's where we fit in. And in this big equation here, we're just a very small part. We're a sub-bullet of this equation of the battlefield there. And this is important because we are not taking over the fight to win this fight. That has to be the host nation, the sovereign nation to do that. And of course, you've got to understand the politics. And it is a political problem first and foremost, and the underlying socioeconomic problems as well. You've got to be able to address those. And that's why civil affairs, psychological operations, and combined with intelligence analysts, we've really got to understand the nature of the problem and the conditions that exist. And of course, when you're countering insurgency, you've got to consider all these factors: religion, culture, ethnicity, and then, as I said, determine the acceptable level of U.S. engagement. Whether we can conduct direct operations or indirect operations, and the host nation really determines how much access and how large scale of operations they will allow U.S. or other external forces to conduct. And that's very important to consider. Now, we talk about foreign internal defense, FID, F-I-D there, which is really the U.S. government, civilian and military agencies, civilian and military, it's joint, it's interagency, that are conducting operations to advise and assist to help the indigenous government, the host nation government, with their internal development and defense plans so that they can defend themselves against lawlessness, subversion, insurgency, and terrorism. That's the nature of foreign internal defense. And we break it up into 3 kinds: indirect, which is really security assistance, international military education and training, all the ongoing peacetime security assistance. Really, Iraq and Afghanistan evolved to combat FID. Once the Iraqis and the Afghan forces were stood up, they developed militaries, and then we conduct combat FID, where we're advising and assisting them and actually participating in kinetic operations directly. And but in the Philippines, we conducted what we call direct FID, where we're providing direct support, intelligence, civil military operations, advice and assistance, but they're doing the fighting. We only fight if fired upon. We don't conduct any U.S. unilateral operations. Afghanistan and Iraq, we've conducted U.S. unilateral operations for many years, and we continue to do so in a very limited extent now. But we conduct much more combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan than we have done in the Philippines. Today, we lost another special operations soldier in Iraq, supporting the Peshmerga, rescuing rescuing Kurds from a prison who were there was about to be a mass execution. So we lost a soldier, the first soldier in 9 years to combat operations in Iraq. All right, another way in historical context is to look at over on the right, General Pershing and Aguinaldo. I told you about that. We lied. We went back on our promise. A lot of people tout that our operations in the Philippines in the turn of the century were a great counterinsurgency. I would not characterize it as counterinsurgency. I'd counter it as pacification. We were occupying the Philippines, and we tried to pacify the resistance. And because we were the power, we did not allow the Philippines their sovereign right to govern themselves. And so, of course, that caused the resistance. And we should learn from that. I mean, look at Afghanistan and Iraq. When the dominant military force is the U.S., that can cause resistance among the local population. So that was pacification. One of the greatest operations that we look back in history, the Huck Rebellion, very little U.S. participation in that. Edward Lansdale supporting then Defense Minister and future President Ramon Magsaysay in the Philippines. Just a small amount of weapons and advice, but Ramon Magsaysay defeated the Hucks both militarily but most important politically, as he made accommodations for land and was able to put down the rebellion. Today we split the difference. We're not conducting major operations, but we're doing much more than Lansdale did, and I will show that to you in the next slides. Now, keys to counterinsurgency. You take all the theory, you take everybody from Galula, to John Noggle, to FM 324, and you can neck it down. You got to do 4 things to counterinsurgency. One is deny sanctuary. All right, you've got to take away their safe haven. Okay, their ability, a place where they can hide, where they're safe from the government forces, where they can train, where they can refit. You've got to take away their ability to move. It's land, sea, and air. Okay, you've got to deny that ability. And that usually comes in the form of population and resources control, passport control, things like that, identification. So you've got to deny their ability to move, deny access to resources, money, cell phones, medicine, weapons, ammunition, and explosives. So deny access to resources. And then the most difficult one is separating the insurgents or terrorists from the support of the population. Okay, and that's what's most hard. And in the Philippines, it's really hard because of family connections, the clans, and then of course the tribal affiliations that make things really difficult. From an intelligence perspective, we like to have a nice, neat order of battle, the OB. We like to know, the platoons, the companies, the battalions. We like to line everything up. They're part of this organization and that one. But in the Philippines, and go back to the original threat slide I showed you, there's so many different groups, but they're not all isolated and separate. There's a lot of cross-pollination. And I like to use this illustration. You might have the grandfather who belongs to the Moro National Liberation Front, and his son belongs to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and his grandson belongs to the Abu Sayyaf group. So you may have that kind of within a family. There are family members who are part of different groups. And what that should tell you is maybe those groups aren't all separate. They're not all distinct. There's so much overlap, which again complicates things if you're an intelligence analyst. All right, this is just a quick graphic of the types of resources that we had in the Joint Special Operations Task Force. In the green, of course, Army. We had elements of a Special Forces Battalion, of a Civil Affairs Company, of a Military Information Support Team or Psychological Operations, Combat Camera, Air Force and Marines who take photographs and video. We, of course, had UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. We also had Marine radio intelligence intercept, communications intercept, as well as one conventional infantry platoon, usually from the 25th ID or the Guam National Guard, helped to provide security. That was the bulk of the Army forces. We had the Navy Special Warfare, a SEAL platoon, Mark V detachment, these boats, RIBs, rigid hull inflatable boats. Here, they're explosive ordnance device teams, detachments. Their UAVs, Ravens and Aqua Puma, and a very interesting capability on a float staging base on Joint Task Force 515, the Navy, after 9/11, very creative, and they took the U.S. naval ship Stockham, which is a pre-positioned logistics ship filled with engineer equipment, a company of M1 tanks, and it floats around in the ocean, which we have all over the world, just waiting to go to war, and so manned by civilian crews. And so on that, they put 2 SH-60 helicopters, Scan Eagle, unmanned aerial vehicle for surveillance. They put a Marine detachment, had a lot of logistics capabilities, and that would spend 0.75 days of the month, 75% of the month, in our joint operational area, providing support to our operations. And that was very useful, very creative on the part of the Navy, and a good use of resources to be able to support counterterrorism operations. The Air Force, we had, of course, an air detachment from the Air Force Special Operations Command and the 6th Special Operations Squadron. We had some military air, the P-3 Orions, which is a submarine hunter, which we use some of their intelligence capabilities for ISR. We had C-12, small airplane for transport. Our military air, both HH and SH-60s. And then we had contract air. The Bell 214 helicopter. In fact, the helicopters that we had, Bell 214s, contract air, they were actually to be sold to Iran in 1979. And of course, after the embassy was taken, all of our military support to Iran stopped. And those helicopters were specifically built to be sold to Iran. And obviously they weren't. And a civilian aviation company flies them, and we use them. CASA 212 as well, another transport aircraft. So we also periodically would have, after the Marine Special Operations Command was activated, we'd periodically have a Marine Special Operations Company rotate through. In addition, we had our interagency support. The FBI, the legal attaché from the office and from the Washington office here. We had elements from the National Security Agency, from the CIA, and we had contractors from Dynacorp and a company that provided augmented communication. So we had, our military, civilian, interagency support, all within about 500 people that were scattered all about. When people talk about small footprint, this is a small footprint. All right, this is our mission, and a lot of times people throw up a mission slide. Okay, go to the next slide. But I want to park on this for a couple minutes here. This is very important. Probably from a military perspective, the best mission statement I've seen in my 34 years in the military. And I can say that because I didn't write it. Okay, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Medina wrote this statement. He was a planner at SOCPAC. Ended up being my chief of staff for a while. But he wrote this, and it really illustrates the entire operation. In fact, if I was only to show you one slide, it would be this one. And so let me talk about this. So the Joint Special Operations Task Force Philippines, JSOTP, in coordination with the U.S. country team. Everybody knows who the country team is. While I was there, the chief of mission was Ambassador Christy Kenny. We had her come and speak last spring. She was the ambassador, and the entire country team. And if you think about it, the country team is the tip of the interagency spear for the United States government. Most all government agencies are represented there, from FBI to CIA to agriculture to USAID. The entire spectrum of the U.S. government is represented on the country team, and we were tightly engaged. We were so engaged that every Tuesday night, my J2 intelligence officer, my J3 operations officer, and my command sergeant major and I would fly to Manila, and we would meet first with all the intel organizations at 9 o'clock in the morning. At 10 o'clock, we'd meet with all the political military, the working group there, and all the organizations. And 11 o'clock, I had a one-on-one meeting. It was really 4-on-1. The ambassador, me, and my J2, J3, and sergeant major, and we would spend an hour planning what we're going to do over the next week. She would ask me what I wanted her to tell the president or the chief of staff of the military, and we would talk about how we wanted her to come down to make a visit, to open a USAID project, use her reputation. She was a great social media communicator, and her reputation was so well known. And we used her to try to influence the president, then President Arroyo, to come down and make her presence known. In fact, it's really interesting because wherever the president went in the Philippines, her approval rating was much higher. But as long as she stayed in Manila, her approval rating was down. So we tried to convince her to spend more time with us, but she didn't. So the country team is important. Our mission is really to strengthen the Republic of the Philippines security forces. And we say security forces very deliberately, because it's not just the military, but it's the police, their intelligence capabilities, so that they could defeat those selected terrorist organizations. And again, we had to be very specific about this. Terrorists, 9/11, that was our constraint. We had to focus on the terrorist organizations, even though the threat was much bigger than that. The purpose, obviously, to protect the Republic of Philippines and U.S. citizens and our interests from terrorist attack while preserving Philippine sovereignty. And that's very, very important. Rarely do you see these two things in a mission statement, country team and sovereignty. But the concept of sovereignty is so important that we felt it had to be in the mission statement so that we could communicate to all members, all U.S. members of the Joint Special Operations Task Force, how important that was. And what that means is we can't do things on our own, that we that the legitimacy of the Philippine government and military is at stake, and we've got to support that. And so we put all of this in this very short mission statement to really to hammer home the importance of all these tasks. And in fact, as a commander, I was very fortunate. Every member in our rotations were individual, not unit, although some units did. But every new soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine that came to the command, I get to give this briefing. I would talk about this mission statement and why, the actions that they take and the missions they conduct are important. All right, operational design. We had 4 lines of operation. Of course, one thing to keep in mind, we designed all this before there was ever an FM 324, before the great counterinsurgency manual in 2006. I mean, we've been doing this since 2001, but it was really based on special operations and in particular special forces doctrine, foreign internal defense. It already existed, but after 9/11, a lot of things had to be reinvented and recreated. Security force assistance and building partner capacity and train, advise, and assist, and organize, train, equip, rebuild, and advise, OTERA. We came up with all kinds of names. But for us, doctrine existed, we knew how to conduct a campaign plan, and we focused on 4 lines of operation. Capacity building, basic train, advise, and assist, all right, so that the Philippine security forces could be successful. Targeted civil military operations, and I'll show some illustrations on that. Targeted means 2 things. One, you want to target the conditions that give rise to insurgency and terrorism. Okay, the education problems, the infrastructure problems, the poverty. And we don't do that ourselves, but we help the government of the Philippines, leading their projects with our support to be able to target those conditions and to help to influence the youth to be productive members of society. The other targeting concept is we target areas that are contested. And through the use of civil military operations, we're able to work with local governors and government officials to try to bring these civil military operations into contested areas. But of course, in order to do that, you've got to have security. All right, so it is a mutually supporting security and development, but we target those areas that are contested. There's information gathering and sharing, which is really intelligence. That's our biggest behind-the-scenes contribution. We were able to fuse our U.S. technical capabilities with Philippine human capabilities to conduct an analysis to be able to conduct effective targeting. And last, information operations, or what we call information and influence activities, or psychological operations. And that's really focused on transmitting the message, but really to enforce and ensure the message of Philippine legitimacy. People talk about hearts and minds, and they think that that's a big concept in counterinsurgency. And the big problem is for us as Americans, we think about winning the hearts and minds. That means we want people to like us. That's really not how it works. I mean, if you're going to think about hearts and minds, you got to think about the indigenous population and their hearts and minds focused on their government, their legitimate government. So we've got to be very careful about saying, hey, we're from America, we built this, and we gave you this, and we really have to say, we're here to help at the request of your government, and they're the ones that are doing this for you with our assistance. All right, just some of the pictures of different things, and of course our training is air, land, and sea. One of the biggest accomplishments that our Air Force and our airmen did was to provide the Philippine military with a night vision capability for their helicopters, which was really important because soldiers did not want to conduct operations at night, because if they were wounded, they couldn't be medevaced. So after they developed this capability, they were able to conduct night evacuation. As you see, this is through night vision from one of the P3s of a night evacuation there. Training, of course, close air support. We really worked on their ability to provide more precision fires rather than area bombing. And maritime intercept operations, very, very important because mobility, the use of the seas. And there's so much maritime traffic out there. So there's a lot more than just, people think, oh, foreign internal defense is just training, the Army to shoot, move, and communicate. It's a lot more. And then, of course, we can talk a lot about joint operations and integration of fires. Civil military operations, I've talked about that somewhat. Medical civic action programs, engineering civic action programs. This is Bashir Arafat. He's an imam from the Islamic Institute of Baltimore. Syrian-born, immigrated to the United States, married an American Army specialist. He's on contract with the State Department. He would come and spend time with us and go around to all the madrasas and talk to the local population and tell them about his life and why he came to the United States. He came because of religious freedom, and he felt that he was more free to practice his religion in the United States than he was in Syria, and that's why he came. Of course, many Filipinos don't know that there are any Muslims in the United States, and so he travels around to try to educate them, and he's a wonderful man. So medcaps, NCAPs. Interestingly, anybody know what the #1 medical procedure that Special Forces medics conduct in the Philippines? Circumcisions of boys reaching puberty. Not a pleasant thing, but that's a fact. Muslim mothers love to bring their kids, and it's a spectator sport. And mothers telling their young boys, don't you cry. It's not a pleasant sight. School renovations. USAID brought in computers in village, and of course the village didn't have any electricity, and so of course they knew that, but they brought in solar power and off-grid electric capabilities there developed so that they could have access to the internet and open up their ability to educate. Area coordination centers, which are really just large roofed areas there that we would build, which would help for training, coordination, but really would become a farm-to-market place for them to sell goods and have town hall type meetings there. Healthcare training. One of the things that Philippine and U.S. doctors did was to provide an EMT capability on the island of Jolo. They trained local in EMT capability, and an NGO donated about 20 ambulances from the United States. Of course, shipped them all to Manila. We couldn't get them from Manila down to Mindanao, but there was a U.S. Navy amphibious ship that was docked there, so they picked them up and brought them down to us. There's a McCormick Amendment about transporting humanitarian supplies on U.S. government. We actually didn't have permission to do that. We were waiting, the bureaucracy, and finally the ship had to sail, and the captain, fortunately, listened to us. We pleaded, please do it, and fortunately, while he was en route between Manila and Zamboanga, we did get permission. But I tell you that because sometimes our own bureaucratic processes really hinder our ability to conduct effective operations. Interestingly, though, after those ambulances arrived, within the first week there was an ambush, and a Philippine a captain and a sergeant were shot and wounded, and these first responders were the first responder, and they saved their life. So it was one anecdotal success story. Intelligence. All right, this is really important. Each of our liaison and coordination elements at every battalion CP would be able to integrate our intelligence. And of course, human, primarily from the Philippine side, and we would fuse that at the battalion level, the task force level, at their combatant command level, and focus on the targeting of specific terrorists, tracking them, and being able to interdict and eventually capture or kill. Another just example of our information operations. These are all different products, and we had local universities, and they actually had this great comic book program that they did, of course, in the local language that the kids loved. And every month we'd have a new edition come out. And if we were ever late, there would be protests. Where's the next edition? It was so popular with the kids. But it was focused on really preventing lawlessness, honorable, living an honorable life within their tribal customs. And it was really a good product. Rewards for Justice is a State Department program. And so we supported that, and we gave out rewards. In fact, that's $5 million in pesos right there. And I'll tell that story in a couple minutes after Abu Solomon was killed. We paid that out. And so we support the State Department's Rewards for Justice. All right, I'm sure you're all familiar with some of the counterinsurgency theories, the ink spot theory, oil spot, whatever you want to call it. This is the island of Jolo. These red hatched areas are the assessed sanctuaries that existed. In 2005, when we started operations there, We conducted an assessment, working with the Philippine military, using civil military operations to target these contested areas, and over time expanded the influence of the Philippine security forces, building wells and roads and hospital or medical clinics and the like. And we continued to expand and surrounding, isolating these areas, trying to prevent, we're going to deny sanctuary, prevent, deny mobility, deny access to resources. And eventually, we conducted two major amphibious landings at night with Philippine Marines and Special Operations Forces. And the reason we did that is because the ASG and their auxiliary, supporting their elements, they had eyes everywhere. And every time the Philippine military moved, text messages would go out, and so they would be able to hide, to get to secure areas. And so we decided to conduct a major deception operation. We did the same typical operations. They left all their compounds throughout the area, and actually they went to the east part of the island here, and then landed the forces at night there. And they were able to take down two of the major base camps and eliminate those sanctuaries. Of course, the problem with that was, and since then they've never really been able to mass forces. But the problem is, when they can't mass, it becomes harder to find. They went underground, supported their families, their clans, and their tribal support. And so, while you can conduct a major conventional operation, and conventional operations can be very much a part of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, by causing them to disperse, it created another difficult intelligence challenge for us. All right, a quick vignette here. Abu Solomon. After Gaddafi John Jelani was killed in that amphibious landing I just talked about, Abu Solomon took over. To give you a time reference here, in March 2006, the ASG bombed the Holo Co-op, which was run by the Notre Dame College in Holo, Catholic school, and they ran this co-op. But the ASG bombed it, killed 5 Muslims, wounded 26. One of the ASG low-level member, who kind of succumbed to our psychological operations program, which we called Descent and Discord, trying to strip away the low-level ASG from supporting the leadership, he became disenchanted. Why are we killing our Muslim brothers? But more importantly, his wife was. And his wife said to him, and this is all from our debriefings and everything, his wife said, look, we've got children, and what has the ASG done for us now? We've got a clinic, our children are going to school, they're getting medical treatment, vaccinations, and what has the ASG done for us? I can't even put milk on the table. Of course, there was a $5 million reward for Abu Solomon. All right, so this is March, and this goes on for some time. He finally decides that, yeah, he's going to defect. And he became an informant, recruited by Philippine military intelligence, and provided information about Abu Solomon. Now, we continue to train, we continue to conduct civil military operations, and then in January of 2007, so 11 months later, after this bombing occurred, he was recruited. He provided what? What did he provide? He provided Abu Solomon's cell phone number, and then of course we were able to track that. And one of the national intelligence agencies detected his cell phone, and so the chief of base walks into our skiff and says to Staff Sergeant Krista Kovac, and says, Krista, I've got this location for Abu Solomon. She, of course, knew that was actionable intelligence. She also knew that the Philippine 6th Special Forces Company was preparing to conduct an operation. They had just finished training with one of our Special Forces teams, and they were going to conduct an operation in that area. So she and Staff Sergeant Light and Specialist Nice downloaded satellite imagery and put together a target intel package, sent that electronically down to the SF team there, and they planned that mission with the Philippine 6th SF Company. That information came in at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. At 6 p.m. that night, that Philippine company was walking out the gate, climbing the mountain in the rain, and at dawn the next morning, sure enough, right where she said, right where the intelligence said, there was their camp. They put out surveillance and security. Abu Solomon wakes up in the morning, walks out of the camp outside the perimeter to take his morning constitutional, right into their arms. They gave him a chance to surrender. He didn't. They shot him, killed him. Then they had a major firefight with the rest of the ASG there, and they secured the area, recovered a lot of weapons and everything. Then they took a digital photo of Abu Solomon, transmitted it back and the informant identified him, and then General Raphael, the task force commander, calls me up and says, hey, can you send the FBI down to get the DNA? Of course, we need the DNA so we can pay out the money. And so of course we did that, although the FBI guys didn't like to take the DNA, and it was fortunate. They always liked to have the SF medics around because they would do that. In fact, just a quick war story, after Gaddafi Janjalani's body was recovered, about 6 months later it had been buried, and we finally found it. Informants led us to it, and we had to get the DNA. Well, the deputy governor, Lady Ann of Holo, Sulu province, she was there as they recovered the body, and they brought it in this building. She starts lighting all these candles around, doing these incantations while the medics are cutting open the femur and taking out the DNA. And she said, I feel the spirit. I said, it is Gaddafi Janjalani. And my medics are telling me this, and it really was. Well, about 2 weeks later, sure enough, the DNA said it was. And I said after that, maybe we need to hire her because she could tell us so. So, $5 million reward, $5 million reward for Gaddafi Janjalani. It's now January 2007. We've got to pay out these rewards. State Department, $10 million, please. No money. Where's the money? Oh, well, remember that NEO, non-combatant evacuation that happened in Lebanon? Remember, if you guys remember that, U.S. civilians, got evacuated out of there, and then we were going to charge the U.S. civilians for the emergency evacuation. And of course, as you know, within the government, if the State Department wants the Department of Defense to do something, they got to pay for it. And so, military interdepartmental, transfer, resources, whatever, MIPR and all that. So you got to transfer that money. So they said, well, we haven't used this reward money, so they took it out of that account and transferred it to DOD to pay for that NEO. And now we needed the money. Well, Karen Hughes was the Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy. She just happened to come on a scheduled visit, and so the ambassador talked to her and says, look, and the funny thing was the State Department, their response was, well, we don't have the money. Do you think they could take an annuity and pay it out over 20 years? So what's that do for our rewards for justice and our legitimacy? So finally, she, once she was made aware of it, it still took a while. The killing happened in January. It wasn't until June of 2006 we actually paid out the money, which is an entirely another interesting story. So they wired the money electronically. Well, the local population, they don't want electronic funds. They want hard, cold cash. Well, you don't want to have $5 or $10 million worth of pesos on the island down there. So what do? Well, had to give them lessons in banking, and we flew them up to Manila. And the problem was there was not $10 million in pesos in hard currency available. Citibank had $5 million, and so we brought them in, and we had them each count their money. One at a time, they would count their money, and then they would wheel it into the big vault, and then we'd show them, give them the passbook, and show them how they could withdraw money, from any bank and everything. And then we'd bring in the next one, and they'd count the same money over and over again. and one of the guys was so excited, he jumped up on the table with the money, and the table broke, and it all fell on the floor. And it took us quite a while to recount and restack the money there. So, but that was one of the things. In fact, when we finally paid out the money, they brought these briefcases of fake money down there, and of course then they took all of them away in the witness protection program after that. But Oliver North came to do a War Stories episode. There's you can go to War Stories and watch a whole episode on this, and he came out, and which is another quick war story. I didn't want him to come. I protested the ambassador to my boss, General Fridovich, but everybody said, no, he's going to come and do this. And so I had my first meeting with him at the embassy, and we sit down there, and I said, look, sir, and he says, oh, don't call me sir. I retired as a lieutenant colonel. You're a colonel. So I'll call you sir. Okay. And I said, look, I want to be frank with you. I did not want you here. And the reason I don't want you here is because I can't have you doing an American story, about American soldiers and how we're winning the war in the Philippines. We're not. This story has to be about the Philippine security forces and how they're achieving success. And oh, by the way, we're providing advice and assistance. And he said, okay, don't worry. He says, if you don't tell my producers back in New York, I'll be your I.O. tool, your information operations tool. And to his great credit, he did. If you watch that, you will see that he talks to all the Filipinos first. And then he talks to Americans, and he gives them the credit for the success of operations. And even in this operation here, the bulk of the operation, I mean, the operation was conducted by them, and the bulk of the support, human from the Philippines, technical support from the U.S., but it was Philippine-led. All right, just last couple things. Some of the measures of success, very, very difficult to measure success in these types of operations, and they're really anecdotal. We like to drive data. We want to know, we go back to Vietnam, we had the cleared, the village assessment tools that we used and everything, but there's really not a lot of ways that you can really measure success. But just some of the things that we looked at, changes in the way things were run. When we first started in 2001, Filipinos would conduct movement to contact, large-scale operations. Later, very precision. And when Javier Malik, when his battalion, he conducted a battalion attack, after that, instead of conducting a military operation, the Philippine military demanded that a warrant be issued for his arrest, and they conducted very precise operations to try to capture him. They had successful operations in Holo. Only one person died, and elections in the Philippines are a contact sport, and many people do die in election violence. One guy died because he tried to steal a ballot box and the police shot him. Philippine government stood up the National Development Support Command, which was to harness the engineers and the medical capabilities of the Philippine military to operate in conflict zones so that they could provide humanitarian assistance. After 10 Marines were beheaded in Basilan in 2007, the Philippines responded not with a large-scale offensive, but with a humanitarian offensive. And they used special forces to go after the perpetrators of that, and they captured or killed them, but everywhere they conducted operations were followed up with medcaps and NCAPs and humanitarian assistance. Of course, a lot of ASG leadership's been killed, and the Armed Forces of the Philippines in central Mindanao, where the MILF challenges are, they are conducting extensive civil military operations. In fact, so extensive, Khalid Musa said that civil military operations are more lethal than brute force, which is really an indication. I met with the MILF leadership, with the Deputy Chief of Mission, the RSO, and the Director of USAID. We spent hours at his headquarters in the middle of MILF territory talking about what we're doing, what we could do, supporting the peace process. And one thing I'll never forget, two things he said in hours of conversation, and two things he said. He said, one, you Americans, you can force the Philippine government to give us our lands. You're America, you can make them do anything. So that was his mindset. And so we could force a sovereign country to do what we want. And he really believed that. And but the second thing was, he said, you can do all this development, you can make our lives better, but if the Philippine government does not solve our political problems and our land, our ancestral domain, if you don't solve the political problems, we will continue the insurgency. And of course, when you think about theory of insurgency, it is a political problem, and more than a military conflict, and it's got to be solved through political processes there. And so I always that's another example of where theory meets the real world, and in fact is right. All right, a couple takeaways. We're not in charge. We are supporting through, by, and with. It's an Armed Forces of the Philippines fight, and they're winning. I've emphasized legitimacy. We don't conduct U.S. unilateral operations. I didn't even talk about the press environment and how the press and the opposition political parties would attack us, but we had to prevent that. And of course, interagency operations are really key. And then lastly, I would always get saying, "Oh, this is a great model. You guys are being so successful. Why don't you guys go do this in Iraq and Afghanistan?" Well, the fact is, everything we're doing, everything I've described, was being conducted in Iraq and Afghanistan on various different scales. But the situation is much different in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you really, we as Americans, we all want models, we want a template, we want a framework, we want a checklist. Well, there are no. What works in one place does not necessarily work in another. Now, there are lessons to learn, and we should study everything. But each situation has to be assessed and analyzed, and a unique campaign plan developed to deal with the situation as it really is, and not as we wish it would be. Too often, we wish the situation to be something that is from our worldview and our mindset. People always ask me what to read. Most of these are probably on your reading list here. I like Jack McEwen, The Art of Counter-Revolutionary Warfare, How to Counter-Organize. I like a lot of old things here. Anna Simmons, though, wrote a great recent piece well, it should be 2013. It's not that old, 1013, the Middle Ages. But she really talks about culture and the challenges that we have. Chinese Unrestricted Warfare, I think, is a great book. Gene Sharp, From Dictatorship to Democracy, Nonviolent Revolution. Great techniques in there. Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals. Everybody thinks of that as socialism and communism, which is true. How to community organize. But many of those techniques apply in situations like this. And of course, our current doctrine in the Special Warfare Center in school is very useful. I'd also commend this to everybody. The Assessing Revolution and Insurgent Strategy Project. This is very comprehensive assessments on, actually there's 23 case studies prior to 1962, 23 from 62 to 2009. Human factors, undergrounds, everything about radicalization, about use of social media and the internet, and how revolutions, resistance, and insurgency are organized. A great resource for all of you to use. You can find this on my blog, and I can post this on, there's about 20 megabytes here because of all the photos, but we can post this so you can access it. Last, I'd just like a couple thoughts. We talk about, irregular warfare. We talk about asymmetric warfare, fourth generation warfare. We talk about, now the SOCOM commander likes to talk about the gray zone. It's this area between peace and war. Okay, that's the middle, the missing middle in there. But what really takes place are revolutions, resistance, and insurgency. And that's what we really have to study. That's what you really have to know. But we have a strategy gap between diplomacy and war. And so, of course, George Kennan in 1948, his memo on political warfare, was to use all the elements, all the strengths of a nation at a nation's command, short of war, to achieve your objectives. Unconventional warfare, which is the foundation of special warfare, which I started out with, it provides a capability to operate in that gap. But what's most important is we need military and intelligence people to really assess the conditions around the world to understand what is happening, whether it's nascent resistance, or full-blown revolution, insurgencies, but hopefully we're identifying resistance and the conditions that give rise to existence before it culminates or results in conflict. And to be able to do that, then we can provide information to policymakers and to develop policy strategies and campaign plans to either support our friends, partners, and allies, or to use existing resistance where our interests are sufficiently aligned to be able to counter our enemies wherever they may be. So, and this is just another way to look at this. We talk about the missing middle, the gray zone, but in the middle here, political warfare, it's diplomatic, persuasion, coercion, aligned economic measures combined with unconventional warfare, traditional counter, information influence activities, security sector assistance. If there's an indigenous force that you want to work with, then that may be an option to operate in that missing middle there. So, Sam Sarkisian, great man, passed away a couple of years ago, wrote many books, but one on unconventional conflict, which I think we call irregular warfare or any of those, but it's political, psychological, multidimensional, and of course all wars are political and psychological, but particularly in unconventional conflicts, you've got to focus on the political and psychological. My definition for irregular warfare? So think about those rules. Think about the application of that. That's my humorous look at complexity in irregular warfare. So, we can talk about who judges the outcome of that. So, all right, that and my alma mater, Ty's alma mater, Pineland University. That's where we learn all this stuff. So, long presentation, but I hope able to give you some insights about theory and practice in a very complex situation that's unique and one not often discussed. So I'd be glad to answer any questions. Yes.
So with the relative decline in ASG's kind of return to banditry tactics,
Kidnap for ransom.
Yeah, exactly. Along with maybe some growing opposition to EDCA, Visiting Forces Agreement. Where do you think the U.S. role in relation to this, the Philippine security forces will be heading in the near future?
Yeah, great question. I just touched on it, but on the 1st of May of this year, the actual Joint Special Operations Task Force stood down. And it was a deliberate effort because, we don't need to sustain this, forever. However, our commitment to the Philippines has not been reduced. I mean, they, as I said, our longest standing treaty ally. And so we will still continue to provide advice and assistance and support, but it will be done in the traditional manner of the security assistance through the Joint U.S. Military Advisory Group at the embassy. And forces still rotate in, but we've been able to scale back our sustained presence there, which is also designed to reduce some of the political pressures. Although, as you see in the Philippines, if you read the news now, this conflict is really on the back burner. What are we really talking about in the Philippines? China. Talking about South China Sea. We're talking about access to islands out there. And so you're seeing actually, although there's political opposition to U.S. presence, there's also political support for increased basing, particularly Navy and Air Force, as a deterrent to China, because obviously the Philippines fighting China will not be kind of a one-sided fight. So.
Quick follow-up: do you think, in the framework of that context of kind of like the China conflict, is the mindset of the U.S. role with Philippine security forces still largely based off of that mission statement of JSFP that you went over?
Well, for part of that mission statement does not encompass relations with China, and that's more of a theater strategic mission, for our and of course what really is the foundation for our mission is the Mutual Defense Treaty, and that's what underpins our strategy for our relationship with the Philippines. Yes.
What's your view on efforts for the conventional army and conventional military to have a role in special warfare, and how can we do it more effectively?
My simple answer to that is we got to use the right forces for the right missions. Okay, and in 1986 when Goldwater Nichols was written, we had a big emphasis on jointness, and that manifests itself in many ways of even all four services trying to do the same types of missions. And I had a boss, General Wagner, who's the Deputy Commander of Joint Forces Command, and then the Commander of U.S. Army Special Operations Command. He used to say, jointness does not equal sameness. And what we've got to be able to do is to use the right forces for the right missions. And there are appropriate missions for conventional forces. I mean, we actually, brought in artillerymen, to train Philippine artillery units to, where the expertise is needed. But what I will say is that, I've been a theater planner. I went to the School of Advanced Military Studies. I've done campaign planning, conventional and special operations. Special operations are suited for these types of missions. We need an army to do, first and foremost, fight and win our nation's wars. And to be able, by doing that, we can deter war, which is really the highest level. But I also think that our military, writ large, can be used across the full spectrum. But we've got to use the right forces for the right mission. Now, one of the things that it's a criticism of our conventional forces, but there's a go big or go home mentality. And I mean, even in Iraq right now, and you look at what our footprint is for our own force protection. Here we were able to have a pretty small element. And even when I went back to command the Georgetown after commanding the battalion there, I noticed we even grew much larger than we like to. And we tend to do that. I mean, it's, nature abhors a vacuum. You keep expanding and expanding. And it's really hard, and this is the real problem we have from the military perspective, is scaling back, particularly force protection, because no commander wants to reduce his footprint or her footprint and then have something happen. And you didn't have all the combat capabilities you need. And so, that it makes it very, very difficult. I mean, the withdrawal from Iraq, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, or the drawdown are very complex for our military because you're really put in a no-win situation. Because if something happens and you've sent that capability home, you're the one on the hook. And so, no, and military people, as planners, we're all worst case planners. We all plan for the worst possible case, that the worst thing is going to happen. And the fundamental military principle really is mass. If a little is good, a lot is better. And as Americans, in the American way of war, we will, not only outfight somebody, we will outspend and outbuild and out-equip anybody. And that's the American way. And so our conventional forces, that's the mindset. And that's the right mindset for winning wars. But it's not always appropriate. And so the key is educated leaders, and coming to courses like this, going to the School of Advanced Military Studies, studying, around the world, working together. It's not separating special operations and conventional forces. It's what is now in the joint operational concept, special operations and conventional forces interdependence. And the fifth soft truth is that most special operations require non-special operations support. And so, but what is different is that sometimes you really want to put special operations in charge. And even in Iraq now, the dominant operational elements are special operations, but it's Third Army in command. They're running the JTF, because that's the way we do it. And that may be most appropriate for that situation. This situation, I think it was appropriate for special operations to be, to be in the lead here, from a U.S. perspective, because the Philippine forces are always in the lead. Yes.
Sir, on your Insurgency 101 slide, you made a point of talking about under the three groups, the external support for the counterinsurgent. If you can speak about it, was there any issue of external support for the insurgent?
Great.
You kind of left that out. If
Sure.
You can speak about it.
Yeah, that's there was quite a bit of support from external. In fact, just a quick vignette about the NSA. Everybody, we have so much criticism of the NSA. I'll tell you, my experience with intelligence analysts, they are very concerned with civil rights. And I mention this because even external support came from the United States. One of the Abu Sayyaf leaders, his brother was an engineer in the United States. And so when there were intercepts of phone calls, the analyst said, this is a U.S. phone call, a U.S. person, and we had to stop, that intercept until approval was gained. And I just tell you that because everybody, after Snowden and everything, you think that our intelligence community are running around spying on us, listening to everything, reading our computers. I will tell you, the professional intelligence analysts and intelligence personnel that I know are very concerned with civil liberties and doing things right and not going to jail. So that's one example. A lot of support from the Middle East, a lot of money coming in. I mean, I didn't even talk about terrorist threat financing and the importance of following the money and where money comes from. A lot of the kidnap for ransom, that the ASG conducts, some of that, of course, is to directly, extort money from families, and that's a whole other thing how that works. But it's also done to demonstrate capabilities to get external funding, from Al-Qaeda and others. In fact, one thing that you might not know, in January, February of 2011, Umar Patek, who was one of the leaders of the JI, long time in the Philippines, he was arrested in Pakistan. And he's now in jail in Indonesia, but he was in in Pakistan with Al-Qaeda planning something for Southeast Asia. So another example of external support. I had a little picture there, some medicine, some weapons, but physical support is a lot harder to get in. But money is the big thing, and of course ideological support is really important. Although it has waned somewhat over the years because they haven't sustained successes over time. One more. Oh, one more. And then you guys gotta go. All right. Any more? All right. Well, I hope you gained a little bit of different perspective, understanding. I'm happy to talk to anybody anytime about this. And Andrea can make the slides available there if you can. Lots of pictures there to look at.
Just email me.
And I'm happy to talk with anybody after this. So thank you. Have a great day.